Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 12B live lesson for today. Now, today's lesson is going to be on the second tutorial from the second unit, which should be about the second part of the Victorian era. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can just get started. Okay, so this first section basically just goes over the fact that there are a lot of different movements that were a part of this era. The Victorian era lasted 63 years, and as a result, there were a lot of different styles and varying themes. So some of them explore deep personal emotions, but others commented on society and issues that they were experiencing in England at the time. Now, the second paragraph starts to tell you about the different movements that actually happened here. There were several literary movements that flourished, that means to thrive or to grow during the Victorian era. So one of them was Romanticism. We went over that a couple lessons ago, and it was mentioned in the previous lesson introducing Victorian literature. Romanticism, if you don't recall, just as a refresher, is a type of writing style that focused on personal emotions that are attached to memories and thoughts. And additionally, focused on nature and contemplation. So what became popular right after that was realism. Realism was pretty much a response to Romanticism. And it was basically a movement of people who wanted to portray life as it really was. They didn't like the fact that Romanticism had a lot of symbolism in it. They didn't like the fact that Romanticism didn't reflect what the everyday person was going through, especially since the Industrial Revolution was still alive and well during that time. They wanted to actually show how people lived from day to day. There was another movement, this will be the third one, called naturalism, that was an offshoot of realism. So naturalism was even harsher than realism wanted to be. So instead of writing about people going to work, coming home, the difficulties of not having enough money or enough standing to have time to yourself, naturalism took that a step further and focused on not just writing about how things are in terms of nature or the outside world, but more importantly, naturalists wanted to show that nature doesn't care about humans at all. Like, well, we've got all this stuff happening in the city, but outside of the city, Mother Nature doesn't care about what humans are doing at all. They were influenced by Charles Darwin. He's the guy that pioneered the food chain and the philosophy of may the survival of the fittest, basically. The strongest survive. So naturalists were focused on showing basically the dirt and grime of city living. They were focused on showing how certain types of difficulties that people went through isn't just a societal thing, it's literally nature running its course, showing humans that it's here no matter what. Now on this next slide, we're going to get into a counter movement. Now, all of the writing movements that we've spoken about so far were developed as a response to each other, but this is directly a counter movement. This movement, called the PRB, or the Raphaelite Brotherhood, was a group whose purpose was actually to oppose or push back on realism. They were like, yeah, that realism stuff, we're not about it. So we're just going to form a group of people who specifically don't like it. So this group was formed by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. They give you that information right here. And they rejected modern realistic conventions and turned back to the past. And by the past, we mean Romanticism. Now, they're called the Raphaelite Brotherhood, because they were inspired by a 16th century, that would be the 1500s, painter whose name was Raphael. And they thought that his paintings and the paintings that came before Raphael had a lot of spirituality and purity involved. So they felt like those influences were what people needed today. So it wasn't just that they were against the realists because they didn't like them. They felt like the point of art is to give people an escape from what they deal with from day to day. So when they say that they were against realism, they were against the idea of making people have to face how crappy life is from day to day. And they argued that art, including writing and poetry, should give people good feelings to help them cope with what's happening around them. So this isn't just being mentioned in this lesson just because. The PRB were actually really important in the Victorian era, and they helped develop visual arts a lot. So they basically pioneered a lot of new ways to do art, in terms of painting, sculpting, lots of other things. And they argued in society about how important art is, art for art's sake, so to speak. And they go over this on slide 7. Pretty much the purpose of art was to be aesthetic, was to be beautiful. That's what they tried to push. And that beauty was supposed to be able to bring peace to people who have difficult lives outside of enjoying the art that they enjoy. Now on this slide, they also go into detail about some of the other people who were part of the movement. So Rossetti was part of the movement. There was another person, another artist whose name was John Everett Millais. And he was a great influence on the symbolist movement. So that means when you use symbols in your art to represent different concepts. They also, even after they disbanded and the movement died down, influenced Victorian writers such as Walter Peter and Oscar Wilde, who emphasized perception and sensation over truth. So basically, art is supposed to make you feel things you can't currently feel. Anyone can look around them and feel crummy. Anyone can look around them and be frustrated or disappointed with how life is around them. But to make someone feel something when they're not in the circumstances to feel it through art was the goal. Okay, here on slide 9, we start to get into Victorian poetry. Now, just like the literary stuff that they gave us details about in the beginning of the lesson, poetry was diverse through this era too. So basically what this lesson is going to do is give you 3 different pieces by 3 different poets. And so give you that information so you can compare and contrast different things in the era. So the very first one that we're starting with is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, she's one of the earliest poets that we're going to talk about, and she was also closer to the Romantic style. So the Romantic style was popular in the beginning of the Victorian era, but then realism moved in and naturalism moved in. So with Elizabeth Browning being one of the earlier poets, she was also the closest to using Romantic style. So we get to learn a little bit of information about her background, where she grew up and what her family was like here. But more importantly, is this paragraph here at the bottom that says much of her work is romantic in style, but addresses Victorian issues. So she used the old form, but she talked about things that were important to people in the Victorian era. So she talked about a lot of social justice stuff. So she talked about being against slavery. She talked about not supporting the oppression of Italians by Austria, which was a thing happening at the time. She was against child labor, which was something that England was still trying to figure out during this time while all of the factories were still going. And she obviously pushed for less restrictions on women's freedoms. Now here on this slide, we get a little more information about her. But the most important thing here is that she had to secretly court and marry another writer whose name is Robert Browning. That's where she got her last name. And Robert Browning's works are also featured. He's the next author in this lesson. So they're gonna go into a little bit more detail with the excerpt here. We're reading a sonnet that she wrote called Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now on slide 12, we get a little more information about the sonnet. You know, I don't go over the reading excerpts, but I will go over the information that you need, that they give you on these slides to help you understand the reading selection a little better when you do read it. Now on slide 12, they give you information about this sonnet. The sonnet is just called Sonnet 43, and it's the 43rd out of 44 sonnets that she wrote while she was courting her husband. So basically she fell in love, and because they couldn't be together like directly or in front of her parents, she wrote poetry about how much she loved him. So what she did was she collected them in a book and published it after they got married so that she could have it in a book to show to him. So the book is called Sonnets from the Portuguese. And the reason why it's called that is because Robert used to call her My Little Portuguese as a nickname. So she named the book after him and everything. Now in the lower half of the slide, now that we've got the background information done, we get information about Petrarchan sonnets. So basically, a Petrarchan sonnet is a sonnet that's broken up into two pieces. There are different types of sonnets, but I'm just going to focus on this one because this is a part of the lesson. So in a Petrarchan sonnet, you have two halves. The first half is 8 lines, and that's called an octave. When you have 8 lines in a stanza, stanzas are basically paragraphs for poetry. Octave is 8 lines, and the rhyme scheme is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, where the A sounds are similar and the B sounds are similar to each other. And then the second half is a sestet. So sestet means 6 lines. I'm sure you could have guessed that just from the way that it is spelled. They have it right here. 6 lines, and those 6 lines have the rhyme scheme of CD, CD, CD. Now, this isn't just broken up by the rhyme schemes, it's also broken up by the purpose of those 2 stanzas. The first 8 lines develop the theme of the poem by making comparisons of what the person loves to other things. And the 6 lines, the sestet, expresses the intensity of the poet's passion. So not only is there rules for how many lines and what the rhyme scheme is, but you have to fit in those separate pieces of information into those lines. Now on slide 13, they go over the metrical pattern. So metrical is the rhythm pattern for the syllables. Now I've gone over this in a couple other lessons, but I know that poetry is a hard thing for everyone to understand. So I'm going to just repeat the same information with the example that they give you here in the hopes that hearing it in a few different ways will help it click for you. So this poem is written in iambic pentameter. And to try to break that down for you, iambic is when there is a sound pattern in the words. Like if you break up all of the words in a single line into syllables, you can find a pattern of an unstressed or short syllable and then a stressed syllable, which is a longer syllable. Pentameter means 5 in meter. So when you see pentameter, it means that whatever pattern it is that's happening, in this case, it's iambic, which is unstressed and then stressed, 2 syllables. That pattern repeats 5 times. Now, there are other types of patterns. There's 2 unstressed and 1 stressed. There is stressed before unstressed, so the opposite of what we're looking at here. But what's important is that they're giving you the pattern by calling it iambic, and that pattern repeats 5 times. So they break it up here with these slashes so that you can actually see the difference. And they even stress the syllables with bold so that you can know which syllables are stressed. The ones that are not bold are unstressed. They also tell you that Barrett Browning uses anaphora in her poetry as well. So anaphora is when you repeat words in multiple lines. So like you take a phrase. It's not the same as just repeating the same word over and over. It's repeating a phrase or part of a line over and over. Now, in this case, she says, I love thee in a lot of the lines. When you read the excerpt, you'll definitely see that. She says, I love thee a lot, and like many times. And when she says that, it creates an expectation in your head of when it's going to pop back up again, because it happens in rhythm. After a certain number of lines, after a certain number of sounds, she says, I love thee. And the reason why this is a literary technique is because that repetition sticks in the brain. Once you get used to hearing something, your brain will fill in when it predicts you're going to hear it next. So that's why anaphora works well in literature to keep people's attention. Because once you've got someone's brain filling in the line for them, they pretty much are getting into the rhythm of the poem without realizing that's what they're doing. Okay. Now we're here at the second author, which is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's husband, Robert Browning. So we get some information about him, his background, his schooling. He's pretty well educated. That's pretty much it. They mention Elizabeth at the bottom and how they got married. He ended up outliving her with a son of theirs, and he wrote pretty much until he died. Now here on this slide, they talk about what he's known for. Robert is known for two things more than anything else. One is simple language. He's known for using short words, simple sentences, very straight to the point. Some people can string lots of different ideas together into a single sentence. He does not do that. He wrote specifically so that anybody could pick up his poetry and understand what he was saying. He thought it was very important for the everyday man to know and be able to educate themselves and enjoy the same things that upper class people did, like poetry. The second thing that he's well known for is the dramatic monologue. Now they go over this a little more on some of the other slides, but just to give you a refresher, a dramatic monologue is when in a play or in a work that's written like a play, sometimes poems are written like that, a single character is giving information and speaking his thoughts in the work to the audience. So think of like a villain monologue. You know, when you're watching a TV show or a movie or anything like that, the villain, once they're discovered by the hero, will go on and on. Here's my plan. Here's my motivation. Here's my background. And they're basically not even talking to the hero at that point. They're just sort of saying it so that you behind the screen can understand the information that motivates them. And we all know this because even when it's not necessary for villains to give their background information, they do anyway. So the dramatic monologue is kind of like that. You'll have a character who is by themselves in a scene, like say if you describe someone being in a room and there's no one there with them. So you're reading about what they think and what they feel and what they're about to do. That's a dramatic monologue. It is one person talking at length, so for a long time, about their thoughts and feelings. Now, what made this amazing for Browning here is that it would be boring if he just wrote monologues, but he's really good at writing them in a way that seems like the person is having a conversation with no one. Excuse me. The skill that he has to be able to fit his dramatic monologues and make them sound like normal speech is a really, really, really big deal. And it's part of the reason why he was so popular. Now, the excerpt that we have from him is My Last Duchess. And we get a little more information about that on the next slide. So again, I'm not going to go over the actual excerpt, but I will give you the information that you need about the poem. So here, we get a summary of it. Pretty much, The Last Duchess is a poem that gives us a little glimpse into the life of a duke. So the duke has a painting of his ex-wife who has died. She's deceased. And it's an excellent painting, but he's showing it off to a representative of the next woman that he's going to marry, his bride-to-be. So he starts off with complimenting the painter on being able to capture his previous wife's essence in the painting. But he ends up starting to criticize her, and through what he says, he makes it very obvious to the guy who's going to deliver messages to the father of the person he's about to marry. He finds out that this duke doesn't really value women or people in general. He's just very arrogant, and he looks down on everyone. So basically what ends up happening, this is a too long didn't read of this, is this duke talks a lot about how he's proud of the quality of a poem. And he talks so much that he reveals that he doesn't actually care very much about the topic of the painting, that he doesn't care about the subject of the painting, even though that's his ex-wife. And he goes on for so long that it's very obvious to the person he's talking to, the scout for his bride-to-be, that he's actually just an awful person. That's pretty much it. So it's one man talking to himself about a poem to someone else and giving away that he's actually trash. That's pretty much the summary for this poem. And this is an example of the dramatic irony that we were talking about earlier, because most of this poem is the Duke talking to himself about the painting. Now here they give you a little more information about My Last Duchess. It was also written in iambic pentameter, just like Elizabeth's poetry, but his is in rhyming couplets. So that means every two lines have the exact same rhyme. If you were to write out that rhyme scheme, it would be A. So two lines have the same sound at the end, and then you move on to the next two lines and they have a different rhyming sound. And they mention here, despite this highly structured form, Browning is able to keep the tone conversational and informal through a variety of techniques. For instance, he uses enjambment to force the reader to read through to the next line without pausing at the line break. Now, just to give you a refresher on enjambment, in case you forgot, enjambment is really simple. You're not going to have any trouble with this at all. If you don't have this in your notes, go ahead and get them. Enjambment is when, instead of writing a single sentence on one line, you cut off the sentence and move the second half or a piece of it to the next line. In a poem, what this means is your eyes focus on the end of the line, but the sentence keeps going on to the next one. When you read it out loud, you're supposed to still read it all like one sentence. But poets will break up their lines for rhyme schemes, for structure, and sometimes they'll break it up to give your eyes a place to focus. Like poets were aware that reading is an active thing. So a lot of them will break up their lines on purpose so that the words they want you to pay attention to most are at the beginning and end of their lines. And they're willing to use techniques like enjambment to get this done. Now they give you a list. They give you a list, sorry. They give you a list here of other techniques that you can look up that Browning uses to create an informal tone. So informal means not formal. So here are the other things that he uses really quick. We're gonna lightning round through them. Contractions are can't, don't, won't, any thing with an apostrophe that's joining two words together, right? Will not, cannot, that kind of thing. Digressions are when the characters stop in the middle of what they're doing to say, it's cool, I'm a chill. Basically, that's what happens. When someone goes on for a long time, they're really chatting, and then they realize they've said everything they have to say, or there's not much more they can add. I digress is something that happens when you've said everything you can say and you're moving on. When people are thinking and talking in real life, they stop and start with different subjects all the time. They don't always announce when they do. So for him to put this in his writing makes it seem more realistic. He uses parentheses. There's a whole example of parentheses right here. Parentheses usually has an aside or additional information. Things he also puts in there that's just stuff that regular people do in conversations. Broken trains of thought that come back up later. Basically, different arguments and imagery like pictures in a description that come up very often. And just everything kind of running together is what they're saying. And then the last one is abrupt changes of direction in conversation. So starting and stopping with what seems like random topics. Now, the last author that we're going to look for or look at today is Matthew Arnold. So they do also give you information about his background, where he was born, where he went to school, and some things that have influenced him. He became an inspector of schools. So he was a person that oversaw the quality of schooling in Britain at the time. And he really wanted to reform the educational system to make it easier for students to be able to learn without interference from a lot of religious interference and things like that. He just wanted to improve the education system in general. He was definitely what we could call an educational reformer is what the word they use here. So over his lifetime, he produced poetry, he wrote stories, and he used to write actual articles criticizing things. He was also religious, but you also have to remember that individualism, that personal relationship with God was being encouraged during this time. So there was a very specific type of relationship with religion that was acceptable at this time. He also criticized a lot of the middle class in Britain, and that made him kind of controversial. He pretty much just felt like the middle class and the rich didn't know or care very much about what was happening to the lower class who was working in factories and things like that. And he used his poetry and writings to make that social commentary. Now on slide 24, they give you a little more information about Dover Beach and how it's written. Again, I don't go through the excerpts, but I will go over this information because sometimes hearing it makes it easier for you to actually go back and read through the sections. So Dover Beach is a poem about a beach. The opening lines emphasize the calmness of the seascape at night. That's where we are right here. There's a lot of repetition of the word is in the first 4 lines that they point out to you. And then they also point out that even though things seem calm in the beginning, he uses the words grating roar, like, you know, when things grate together, they're scraping together. That's not a very elegant or calm picture, right? He also uses the phrase, the eternal note of sadness in. So the poem starts off very calm and then takes a turn for basically describing his emotions and how they relate to the beach. Religion is also something that happens a lot in this poem, and they point this out to you in slide 26. The sea is a symbol that's supposed to represent faith in this poem. And the issue of religion is addressed directly in the 3rd stanza or paragraph of this poem. So basically, he talks about people experiencing religion without doubt. and he thinks that faith is important, but the way that people practice isn't up to snuff. And he just wants things to go back kind of to how they used to be, because he feels like faith being practiced the way that it was uh, when he was younger is something that he views as stable, and he thinks that society would benefit from it. Now, lastly, there is a section here on slide 28 on Victorian novels. So they basically just give you an overall overview of what novels were like during that time. So novels became especially popular in the Victorian age. Before, people weren't really reading long, big stories like that. They were reading like chapter by chapter short story releases, or just short stories in general. The novel was made a staple. Like, novels were not a thing that you could go to a bookstore and get, or to a library and get. But the Victorian age made novels so popular that it became a regular genre that we acknowledge today. So they give you the definition of a novel. It is a long work of fiction that usually contains the following features, and they list these features for you: a complex plot, including subplots and spanning a few settings. So they mean the story happens in a few different places at a few different times. If you're writing a short scene, you don't really have to do more than show where people are exactly at that moment. But when you have a story, people move, people go to do things, they leave, they come back, they go off on a quest, they come back. Some people leave and they don't come back. So there's just a lot of different time settings and places. There are major and minor characters in a novel. So instead of just having everyone who's important be the only people who exist, there's usually in a novel, there's background characters, and characters that don't show up that often. And then a significant overall theme. So instead of just a story that's meant to teach you a lesson or something like that, usually Victorian novels are where themes in novels became super big. So now there's a section on the Victorian reader. So they talk about the type of people who were reading novels at this time. Most Victorian readers at this time, especially because of the Industrial Revolution, were not interested in reading about what aristocrats and rich people were doing in their time. They also didn't want to read about medieval heroes. Things just seemed too far away from them. What they wanted was an escape, but a realistic escape. So this is where the idea of stories that were written around the idea of real people, but with fantasy elements or extra elements and stuff, this is where that became popular. Readers were drawn to depictions of ordinary life and characters with whom they could identify. So this is where the idea of what a novel is started to solidify, and it's not that far from what it is that we expect a novel to be like today. So they give you some notable characteristics about Victorian novels, just the things that they have in common. They closely represent the real social life of the age, often including criticism. They emphasize people's relationships to society. They're typically long and dense with multiple characters and plots. And they include narrative interruptions where the narrator pauses in the action of the story to address the reader directly. Now we're getting around to Victorian novelists. So we talked about what the novels themselves are like. We talked about what the people who read them are like. And now we're talking about the people who write them. So a lot of the stuff that came out in the Victorian age was more complicated than the audience realized at the time. There were realistic settings and characters, but a lot of the time the authors who wrote them made the settings and lots of things surrounding these people full of symbolism. So in the Victorian era, basically, people read these for plot and suspense. They wanted to be surprised. They wanted something new. But now we read for deeper meanings to try to find hints of things, to try to figure out, oh, well, what was this referring to? This reference, I don't get it. What does it mean? There's depth in the ideas that you can find in Victorian novels nowadays. They spend the second paragraph talking about Charles Dickens, who was one of the most popular Victorian novelists ever. Not quite as big as Lord Tennyson, but he was pretty up there. They talk about one of his novels, which is Hard Times, where he combines storytelling, humor, empathy, and irony with social criticism. He definitely was the sort of person to write about what the everyday man was going through. Dickens himself identified as a realist writer. He wanted to expose the differences between the rich and the poor, and help people see that not only that they were different, but that things should be done differently. Now they give you a list of other novelists that were here at the time. So they give you a list here. There's the Bronte sisters, which is Emily, Charlotte, and Anne. These were other novelists that were popular at the time. The Bronte sisters were the opposite of Dickens, and they were influenced a lot by Romanticism. So basically, they wrote a lot about the drama that happens between women in the lower classes. They usually publish their works under male pseudonyms because having a male name gave them a higher chance of actually being published, and people were more likely to receive the book well if it was written by a man at the time. Charlotte Bronte is known, very famous for Jane Eyre, which is the story of an orphan who becomes a governess and falls in love with her employer. So it's just stuff like that. That's the type of stuff that the Bronte sisters wrote. There are other authors, and they give you another list here. William Makepeace Thackeray, Anthony Trollope, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Samuel Butler. Now, it's important to write these names down, even if you're not copying down the whole sentence. If it says other important authors who wrote using realistic themes, all you have to do is say other realist authors and then write all of these names down. That way, if you get a question on the test, which of these authors is or isn't a realist writer, you'll actually have the list and you'll know. Oh, there is a tidbit here. Towards the end of the Victorian era, British novels began to lean more towards naturalism. This movement is exemplified by the works of the late Victorian novelist Thomas Hardy. And I think that's about it for this lesson. Yeah. So the important thing to keep in mind here with this specific lesson is just that there's a lot of information, a lot of historical information that's here. Most of the information that you're dealing with in this lesson is just about the background of the Victorian writers. There's so much that went on during that era. There's only so much the lesson can show you. So a lot of that was just sort of an info dump of what was expected at the time and how things developed. But that tends to be how these lessons go. You guys are in the 12th grade class. So at this point, you're just learning about different literary movements in history and reading samples of it. Okay, that actually took a little less time than I thought. But that is about it for that specific lesson. As per usual, if you are having issues with understanding the actual readings, please reach out to a tutor. Most of you can get our scheduling for tutoring from your advocate or your mentor. And you can also feel free, if you have any short questions, anything that we can fire back at you really quick, you can email us at english@atsedu.net and we'll get to you as soon as possible. But other than that, my name is Miss Amber and I'm signing off for today. Good luck with your English class.